What could make the most feared warriors in medieval Europe tremble with dread? What mysterious force could turn hardened Norse raiders, men who terrorised coastlines from Ireland to Constantinople, into superstitious whispers around campfires? The answer lies buried in the frozen landscapes of the far north, in a story that has been all but erased from our common understanding of the Viking Age. In the popular imagination, Vikings stand as the unchallenged predators of the early medieval world. Their longships brought terror to coastal communities across Europe. Their battle prowess became legendary, and their conquests reshaped the political landscape of an entire continent. But history, as always, tells a more complex tale. For in the vast primeval forests and snow-covered tundra of the far north, there existed a people so enigmatic, so perfectly adapted to their harsh environment, that they became the stuff of Norse nightmares. A tribe that not only resisted Viking expansion, but actively terrified the terror-bringers themselves. These were the Biamians, a mysterious people who inhabited the northernmost regions of what is now Finland, northwestern Russia, and the Kola Peninsula. Unlike the farming and seafaring Norse, the Biamians were masters of the deep forests and frozen wastes, regions the Vikings called Biamaland in their sagas. Their territory formed a shadowy borderland between the known world and what the Norse imagination populated, with giants, spirits, and other supernatural beings. Yet the Biamians were very real, and the threat they posed to Viking ambitions was tangible. "Beware the Watchers in the White Forest," reads a fragmentary runic inscription found on a stone near Trondheim. "They see without being seen. They kill without warning. They are not men as we know men." This cryptic warning, dated to approximately 950 CE, offers us a rare glimpse into the psychological impact the Biamians had on their Norse neighbours. It speaks of a fear that ran contrary to the Vikings' carefully cultivated image of fearlessness, a fear that shaped Norse expansion and trade patterns for centuries. The story of the Biamians and their resistance against Viking encroachment is not merely a tale of military conflict. It is a chronicle of cultural collision, environmental mastery, spiritual beliefs, and economic rivalry. It reveals how a numerically smaller population could effectively defend their homeland against one of history's most successful expansionist cultures. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that history is rarely as simple as conquerors and conquered, that even the most fearsome warriors could find themselves outmatched when venturing beyond the boundaries of their understanding. This is the forgotten story of the people who terrified the Vikings. Before we can understand the unique threat posed by the Biamians, we must first situate ourselves in the world of the Vikings, a world of expansion, exploration, and exploitation that defined the period from roughly 793 to 1066 CE. This era began with the infamous raid on Lindisfarne Monastery in Britain and expanded into a complex web of trade, settlement, and conquest that stretched from North America to the Middle East. The Norse were not simply raiders, though their reputation for violence was well earned. They were also farmers, traders, explorers, and settlers who established networks spanning thousands of miles. Their ships, technological marvels of the age, allowed them to navigate rivers as easily as open seas, penetrating deep into continental interiors. Their martial culture prized individual prowess and courage, creating a society where reputation and honour were as valuable as material wealth. By the 9th century, Viking expansion had reached a fever pitch. Norse settlers had established footholds in Ireland, England, Scotland, and the North Atlantic islands. Rurik and his followers had begun the process that would create the Kievan Rus state in what is now Russia and Ukraine. Danish warlords threatened Paris, while Swedish merchants traded as far east as Baghdad and Constantinople. Yet despite this remarkable expansion, there remained regions that resisted Viking dominance, areas where geography, climate, or local resistance made Norse conquest impractical or impossible. The dense forests and marshlands of what would later become Finland and northwestern Russia formed one such frontier. "The land of Bjarmaland lies beyond Finnmark," wrote Adam of Bremen in his 11th century chronicle, a region of perpetual snow and incredible hardship, where men practice arts unknown to Christian people. This terse description hints at both the geographic isolation and cultural distinctiveness of the Biamian realm. It was a place where conventional Viking advantages, their ships, their agricultural practices, their familiar battle tactics, counted for little. The Biamians themselves remain somewhat enigmatic in the historical record. They were likely related to the Sami and Finnic peoples who inhabited northern Scandinavia and the Kola Peninsula, though with distinct cultural practices and social organisation. Archaeological evidence suggests they maintained a semi-nomadic lifestyle, following seasonal patterns of hunting, fishing, and trading. Unlike the hierarchical Norse society, Biamian communities appear to have been more egalitarian, with leadership based on skill, wisdom, and spiritual authority rather than hereditary claims or martial prowess. What made the collision between Vikings and Biamians particularly noteworthy was the complete reversal of the typical power dynamic. Throughout Europe, Viking raiders exploited their mobility, surprise, and fearsome reputation to dominate militarily superior forces. Yet in the far north, it was the Vikings who found themselves disoriented, vulnerable, and at a severe disadvantage against an enemy that seemed to materialize from the landscape itself, only to vanish just as quickly. But what exactly made these forest-dwelling people so formidable? How did they transform the harsh northern environment from a liability into their greatest weapon against Norse encroachment? Have you ever experienced the profound silence of a snow-covered forest in midwinter? The way sound is simultaneously muffled and amplified. How visibility shifts with each snowfall. How the very air seems to crystallize in your lungs. Now imagine trying to navigate this alien landscape as a Viking warrior, a man raised in the relatively mild coastal climate of Norway or Denmark, accustomed to the rhythms of farming and seafaring rather than the deep mysteries of the taiga and tundra. The Biamians' first and perhaps greatest advantage lay in their intimate understanding of one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. Archaeological evidence from settlements dating to the 9th and 10th centuries reveals a people who had developed sophisticated technologies for survival in extreme cold. Unlike the Vikings, whose winter activities were largely confined to their longhouses and immediate surroundings, the Biamians remained mobile and active even during the harshest months. They move across the snow like spits, reported an Arab traveller named Ibrahim ibn Ahmad, who accompanied Viking traders to the northern markets around 920 CE. Their feet are bound with strange devices that prevent them from sinking, and they pull their goods on sleds that glide effortlessly where our horses would founder and die. These strange devices were, of course, skis and snowshoes, technologies that had been refined over thousands of years in the northern forests. While such implements were not entirely unknown to the Norse, the Biamians employed them with a mastery born of necessity and constant use. Archaeological finds for the period include skis of various designs, some clearly optimised for speed across open tundra, others for manoeuvrability in dense forest. The Biamian advantage extended beyond mere transportation. Their clothing, constructed from layers of fur, leather and woven plant fibres, provided superior insulation compared to the Vikings' woolen garments. Analysis of preserved textiles suggests the Biamians used a sophisticated understanding of how different animal pelts performed in various conditions. Reindeer fur for extreme cold, sealskin for wet conditions, fox and marten for lightweight warmth. Perhaps most significantly, the Biamians had mastered the art of constructing shelters that could be rapidly assembled and disassembled as they moved through their territory. These ranged from semi-permanent winter lodges built partially underground for insulation to temporary structures that could be erected in hours using available materials. This mobility allowed Biamian communities to exploit seasonal resources across vast territories while remaining elusive to potential Norse raiders. But the true genius of Biamian environmental adaptation lay in how they transformed the challenges of their homeland into strategic advantages. The extreme cold that threatened to kill unprepared invaders was, to them, a familiar companion. The deep snows that impeded Viking movement became highways for their skis and sleds. The limited visibility of forest and snowstorm became their cloak of invisibility. Consider the account from the saga of Olaf Tryggvason, which describes a failed Viking expedition into Bjarmaland around 995 CE. Thorir led 30 men into the White Forests seeking the Biamian trading post. For 3 days they marched, seeing no living soul, yet feeling always that eyes followed their every move. On the 4th morning, they awoke to find their sentries dead, their throats cut without a sound, and strange marks in the snow all around their camp. Thorir ordered a return to the ships, but only 11 men completed the journey. This account highlights a critical aspect of the Biamian advantage, their ability to monitor Viking movements while remaining unseen, a skill that created a profound psychological impact on Norse expeditions. The Vikings, accustomed to being the unseen threat arriving from the sea, found themselves disoriented when the tables were turned. But environmental mastery alone cannot explain the Biamians' effectiveness against Viking incursions. Their success also relied on a unique approach to warfare, one that utterly confounded the Norse martial tradition and transformed confident warriors into frightened, superstitious men stumbling through an incomprehensible nightmare. What happens when the most feared warriors of the age encounter an enemy who refuses to fight on their terms? What becomes of battle prowess when there is no battle to be fought? Only an endless, nerve-shredding game of cat and mouse where the roles are constantly reversed. The Vikings had built their fearsome reputation on a specific style of warfare. Their combat doctrine emphasized shock, aggression, and psychological intimidation. Viking warriors would form a shield wall for defense or charge as individual heroes seeking glory and recognition. Their battles were typically decisive affairs, violent, bloody, but relatively brief confrontations where superior force, courage, or tactics would determine a clear victor. The Biamians rejected this entire paradigm. "They do not fight as men fight," wrote Byzantine diplomat Constantine Zuckerman after interviewing Norse merchants in Constantinople around 950 CE. They appear from nowhere, strike like lightning, and vanish like mist. They leave no tracks in snow that should hold the imprint of an infant's crawl. Some say they can transform into wolves or bears, though this is surely superstition. What is certain is that they have made the forests and mountains into weapons more deadly than any sword. Archaeological evidence supports this description of Biamian asymmetric warfare. Unlike Viking burial sites with their prominent display of swords, axes and shields, Biamian graves contain different weapons. Lightweight hunting bows optimized for accuracy rather than power, slender, needle-pointed spears designed for silent killing rather than battlefield thrusting, knives with distinctive curved blades, ideal for swift, silent throat-cutting. The Biamian combat doctrine appears to have been built around 5 key principles that directly countered Viking strengths. First, absolute avoidance of direct confrontation. The Biamians recognised that in a straightforward clash of arms, the physically larger and better armoured Vikings would likely prevail. Instead, they employed what modern military theorists would call asymmetric warfare, attacking only when they held overwhelming advantage, typically through ambush or night raids. Second, environmental manipulation. The Biamians excelled at using their landscape as both weapon and shield. They constructed hidden pathways through seemingly impassable terrain, created disguised pit traps along likely Viking routes, and developed techniques for moving across frozen lakes and rivers that would not support the weight of Norse raiders. Third, psychological warfare. The Biamians understood that fear could be more debilitating than physical wounds. They deliberately cultivated an aura of supernatural mystery, leaving inexplicable signs for Vikings to discover. Strange symbols carved into trees, carefully arranged animal bones, or the bodies of slain Vikings positioned in ritualistic patterns. But did the Biamians truly possess supernatural abilities, as many Vikings came to believe? Or were these merely clever tactics designed to exploit Norse superstitions? Consider the account from the saga of Halfdan the Black, which describes an encounter around 870 CE. The Biamian fighters could move without sound, even through fresh snow. They would kill a sentry and vanish before the blood ceased to flow from the wound. When pursued, they would run toward impassable cliffs, only to disappear as if the very rock had swallowed them. Halfdan's men began to whisper that they fought not men but spirits, and fear spread through the camp like poison. The reality behind these seemingly supernatural feats was likely a combination of exceptional skill and clever deception. The Biamians had developed specialized footwear that distributed weight to prevent breaking through snow crust. They crafted clothing from white furs that provided near-perfect camouflage in winter conditions. They established hidden shelters and escape routes throughout their territory, creating the illusion that they could materialize and disappear at will. Fourth, targeted elimination. Unlike the Vikings, who often sought to demonstrate martial prowess through conspicuous combat, Biamian fighters prioritized efficiency and results. They specifically targeted Viking leaders, scouts and sentries, anyone whose death would create maximum disruption with minimum risk. The archaeological record provides grim testimony to this approach. A mass grave discovered near the White Sea, dated to approximately 925 CE, contained the remains of 15 Viking warriors. Forensic analysis revealed that 12 had been killed by nearly identical wounds, a slender blade inserted at the base of the skull or between the vertebrae of the upper spine. These precision kills suggest highly trained fighters who prioritized silent, instant lethality over battlefield glory. Fifth and finally, coordinated withdrawal. The Biamians understood that their advantage lay in mobility and elusiveness. They rarely attempted to hold ground against Viking forces, instead striking and immediately retreating to prepared positions or dispersing into the landscape in ways that made pursuit impossible. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Biamian combat doctrine was how it was transmitted and taught. Unlike the Vikings, whose warrior culture celebrated individual heroes and passed down combat techniques through public display and apprenticeship, the Biamians appear to have maintained secret hunting societies that trained fighters from childhood in specialized skills. The forest people select certain children before they can walk, reported an anonymous source quoted in the Chronicle of Novgorod around 1070 CE, and raise them to move silently, to endure cold that would kill an ordinary man, and to kill without hesitation or remorse. These children become neither fully human nor fully animal, but something between that inspires terror in all who encounter them. While this account undoubtedly contains exaggeration, it hints at a systematic approach to developing specialized fighters, a proto-special forces that could effectively counter Viking military advantages. Archaeological evidence from Biamian settlements includes training areas where young people practiced moving silently through various terrains and hitting small targets with arrows from different positions. The effectiveness of these ghost warriors was so profound that it fundamentally altered Viking behaviour in the northern regions. Norse sagas record numerous instances where experienced warriors refused to venture into Biamian territory, regardless of potential wealth or glory. Some jarls and kings were forced to offer triple the normal share of plunder to entice men to join expeditions to Biamaland, and even then, desertion rates were exceptionally high. But the Biamians' resistance to Viking encroachment went beyond mere military tactics. Their entire culture, from spiritual beliefs to social organisation, seemed designed to unnerve and confound the Norse worldview, creating a psychological barrier as effective as any physical defence. Spirits and sorcery, the psychological war. Have you ever felt that peculiar sensation of being watched while alone in the wilderness? that prickling awareness that raises the hair on your neck and quickens your breath. Now imagine experiencing that feeling continuously for days or weeks while venturing through a hostile territory where every shadow might conceal a deadly enemy. This was the psychological reality for Vikings who dared to enter Biamian lands, a constant state of hypervigilance that gradually eroded morale and decision-making capacity. The psychological dimension of the Biamian-Viking conflict may have been more decisive than any physical confrontation. The Biamians seem to have intuitively understood what modern military theorists call psychological operations, the use of fear, uncertainty, and cultural dissonance as weapons against an enemy. The men speak of eyes in the darkness, wrote Thorbjorn Horncloffi, a skald in the court of Harald Fairhair around 900 CE. They feel the gaze of the forest people even when no living soul can be seen. Some swear they hear whispers in a tongue no man can understand, carried on winds that should not speak. Even the bravest grow fearful after 7 nights in that accursed land. This psychological warfare operated on multiple levels, beginning with the fundamental disorientation experienced by Vikings in the Biamian environment. The Norse were a people who navigated by coastlines, stars, and familiar landmarks. The deep forest and featureless winter landscapes of the far north deprived them of these reference points, creating a profound sense of disorientation that the Biamians deliberately exacerbated. Archaeological evidence suggests the Biamians constructed false trails that led Viking parties in circles or toward natural hazards. They removed or altered landmarks that might aid navigation. They even developed techniques for disguising their own tracks while creating misleading trails that Vikings would follow into ambush positions. But perhaps the most powerful psychological weapon in the Biamian arsenal was their spiritual tradition, a complex shamanic practice that appeared utterly alien and deeply unsettling to the Norse mind. The Viking religious worldview, while acknowledging magic and supernatural forces, operated within a relatively structured cosmology. Norse shamanic practices, Sida, existed but were viewed with ambivalence and typically practiced in specific ritual contexts. By contrast, Biamian spirituality appears to have been more fluid, pervasive, and integrated into everyday life in ways that the Vikings found difficult to comprehend. Their sorcerers do not merely speak with spirits, but become them, reported a Christian missionary named Thangbrand, who encountered Biamians around 997 CE. They wear masks of bark and bone that transform them into beasts and birds. They consume potions that send their souls wandering, while their bodies lie as if dead. Most terrifying of all, they preserve the bodies of their dead in a manner that neither buries nor burns them, but keeps them in a state between life and death. This last observation refers to the Biamian practice of mummification, a custom thoroughly documented in archaeological sites across their territory. Unlike the Vikings, who typically cremated or buried their dead with grave goods, the Biamians developed techniques for preserving important individuals. Bodies were carefully dried, using smoke and cold, treated with preservative resins derived from local plants, and wrapped in birch bark and animal hides. These mummified ancestors were not hidden away, but kept in sacred structures at the periphery of settlements. They served as spiritual guardians and advisors, consulted through elaborate rituals conducted by shamanic practitioners. To Vikings who encountered these practices, it appeared that the Biamians lived alongside their dead in a manner that violated natural order. The psychological impact of such encounters cannot be overstated. Norse cosmology maintained clear boundaries between the living and the dead. The preserved Biamian ancestors, with their leathery skin, hollow eye sockets, and grimacing expressions, represented a horrifying liminal state that suggested the normal rules of life and death did not apply in these northern forests. But the most psychologically devastating aspect of Biamian spiritual practice may have been their shamanic rituals. Archaeological evidence includes ceremonial drums, masks representing various animals, and small sculptures depicting transformational states between human and animal forms. These artifacts support saga accounts of elaborate ceremonies that Vikings occasionally witnessed, or more commonly, glimpsed from hiding places while scouting Biamian settlements. They gathered around a great fire as darkness fell, recounts the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, describing an incident around 920 CE. Their shaman wore the skull of a bear atop his head, its teeth and eyes still in place, and a cloak of white furs that seemed to glow in the firelight. He beat a drum of stretched skin, painted with symbols no man could read, and as the rhythm quickened, others began to twitch and jerk as if possessed. Some fell to the ground, foaming at the mouth, while others began to howl like wolves and crawl on all fours around the fire. Egil's men fled in terror, believing the Biamians were transforming into beasts before their eyes. Modern anthropological understanding suggests these were likely trance-inducing ceremonies similar to those practiced by other circumpolar peoples. The participants weren't literally transforming, but entering altered states of consciousness through rhythmic sound, movement, and possibly psychoactive substances derived from mushrooms or plants found in the region. To the Vikings, however, such rituals represented a frightening dissolution of the boundary between human and animal, a transgression of natural categories that suggested dangerous spiritual power. Norse mythology contained shapeshifters, such as berserkers who took on bear-like attributes, but these were specific, limited phenomena. The apparent Biamian ability to move fluidly between human and animal states on a communal scale represented something far more disturbing. The Biamians appear to have recognized the psychological impact of their spiritual practices on Viking observers and deliberately amplified it. Archaeological evidence includes spirit posts, carved wooden pillars featuring human and animal faces, positioned along likely Viking approach routes to Biamian territories. These served both as territorial markers and psychological deterrents, creating the impression that supernatural guardians watched over the boundaries. Perhaps most ingeniously, the Biamians developed what might be called staged supernatural encounters, carefully orchestrated events designed to convince Vikings they had witnessed something beyond natural explanation. 3 nights into the forest, records a fragment preserved in the Hauksbok manuscript, we came upon a clearing where no clearing should be. In its centre stood a circle of antlers thrust into the earth, and within this circle lay the bodies of 7 men, our own scouts who had gone ahead 2 days prior. Their eyes had been removed, yet there was no blood on the snow. Their weapons remained in their sheaths, undrawn. Around the circle, wolf tracks led in all directions, yet no tracks led to or from the bodies themselves. Thorvald ordered immediate return to the ships, saying no plunder was worth facing such witchcraft. Modern analysis suggests this was likely a carefully staged tableau. The Biamians probably killed the scouts through ambush, transported their bodies to the prepared location, and used various techniques to disguise their own tracks while creating the misleading wolf prints. The missing eyes, a detail repeated in several accounts, may have been a deliberate choice to suggest the victims had seen something they should not have seen, or to prevent their spirits from finding their way back to warn other Vikings. The cumulative psychological effect of these encounters created what one saga calls the Biamian dread, a specific type of fear that affected even veteran Viking warriors who had faced countless conventional dangers without flinching. This dread combined elements of disorientation, supernatural terror, and the profound unease of being constantly observed by an unseen presence. Men who had stood unflinching in the shield wall at Ashdown, notes the saga of Harold Fairhair, who had laughed while English arrows fell like rain around them, would start at every sound in the Biamian forests. They would wake screaming from nightmares, claiming the forest people had visited them in dreams. Some refused to sleep, others refused to stand watch alone. When the Biamians finally attacked on the 7th night, many of Harold's finest warriors threw down their weapons and ran blindly into the darkness, never to be seen again. This psychological dimension helps explain how a relatively small population could effectively resist Viking expansion, by making the cost of each expedition into their territory prohibitively high. not just in lives lost but in the psychological trauma inflicted on survivors. The Biamians created a defensive barrier as effective as any wall or fortress. But the relationship between these peoples was not solely defined by conflict. There existed another dimension to their interaction, one based on trade, exchange, and mutual economic interest that created a complex dance of cooperation and competition. What could a harsh, remote northern land possibly offer that would draw Viking merchants despite the deadly reputation of its inhabitants? What treasures could justify the risk of venturing into territories where so many had disappeared without trace? The answer reveals a fascinating economic dimension to the Viking-Biamian relationship, one that transformed simple animal products into objects of desire across the medieval world. From the land of Bjarmeland comes wealth beyond measure, wrote Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who encountered Viking traders in the Volga region around 922 CE. Furs so fine that emperors and caliphs compete for their possession. Ivory whiter and finer than any elephant's tusk. Amber clear as honey, with insects preserved inside like immortal memories. And other things spoken of only in whispers. Medicines that can cure any ailment, potions that inflame desire, and talismans that protect against all harm. Archaeological evidence confirms this account of a thriving trade in luxury goods from the far north. The Biamians occupied territories rich in resources that commanded extraordinary prices in distant markets. Chief among these were soft gold, the lustrous furs of Arctic fox, sable, marten, and other northern species, whose pelts provided both warmth and status to elites across medieval Europe and Asia. A single prime black fox pelt could be worth more than its weight in actual gold when sold in Constantinople or Baghdad. The Biamians were master trappers who understood the habits of fur-bearing animals and developed specialised techniques for capturing them without damaging their valuable coats. They also pioneered methods for processing and preserving furs that maintain their quality during long-distance transport. Beyond furs, the northern territories yielded other valuable commodities. Walrus ivory, actually the tusks of walruses, was highly prized for carving and ornamentation in an era when elephant ivory was increasingly difficult to obtain. Amber, fossilised tree resin found along Baltic and White Sea coastlines, commanded high prices for its beauty and supposed medicinal properties. Falcons trapped in the northern regions were considered the finest hunting birds available and were exported at enormous profit to aristocrats across Europe and the Middle East. The Biamians also traded in more esoteric goods. Archaeological evidence suggests they collected and processed certain fungi, plants and animal products believed to have medicinal or magical properties. These included chaga mushrooms, which grow on birch trees and were valued for their immune-boosting properties, angelica root used to treat respiratory ailments, and castoreum, a secretion from beaver glands used in perfumery and medicine. This rich trade created a fundamental tension in Viking-Biamian relations. On one hand, the Norse coveted these valuable northern commodities and sought to control their flow to international markets. On the other hand, direct access to the source regions was extraordinarily dangerous due to Biamian resistance. This tension produced three distinct patterns of economic interaction, each with its own dynamic. The first and most peaceful was direct trade at established market sites. Archaeological evidence reveals several trading posts located at the boundaries between Viking and Biamian territories. These settlements, such as the one discovered at Staraya Ladoga near present-day St. Petersburg, show evidence of both cultures coexisting during specific market seasons, when trading was conducted under mutually agreed rules. In the month when ice begins to break, notes the saga of Irvar Odd, the Biamians come down to the Great Lake with 20 sleds laden with furs and ivory. They make camp on the eastern shore, and for 9 days they trade with any who come in peace. Their shamans and our priests declare this time sacred. No weapon may be drawn, no blood spilled. Any who violate this peace are given to the gods. This reference to a religious dimension to trading periods is supported by archaeological findings. Several boundary trading sites contain evidence of ritual structures where representatives of both cultures apparently performed ceremonies to establish a temporary sacred truce. These rituals likely involved oath-taking, sacrifice, and the invocation of spiritual guardians to witness and enforce the peace. The second pattern was indirect trade through intermediaries. Rather than risk direct contact with the Biamians, many Viking merchants preferred to deal with third parties who specialised in northern trade. These middlemen were often individuals of mixed heritage or smaller tribes who maintained peaceful relations with both cultures. The Karelians bring Biamian goods to the winter market at Aldigjuborg, records a Norwegian merchant's account from around 1050 CE. They demand silver of the purest quality and weigh each coin with suspicious care. When asked about the source of their furs, they become evasive, claiming the Biamians would kill any who revealed the locations of their trapping grounds. This indirect trade allowed Vikings to access valuable northern commodities while avoiding the dangers of Biamian territory. However, it also meant paying premium prices to intermediaries and having no control over supply sources, a situation that frustrated Norse merchants accustomed to more direct approaches to commerce. The third and most contentious pattern was what might be called trade raiding. Viking expeditions that attempted to bypass normal trade channels through force. These were essentially attempts to eliminate Biamian middlemen and directly access the sources of valuable commodities or the stockpiles where they were gathered. The most famous of these expeditions is recorded in the saga of Olaf Tryggvason, which describes a raid led by the Norwegian king around 995 CE. Olaf sailed 3 ships into the White Sea, seeking the great treasure house of the Biamians, which was said to contain furs and ivory worth a king's ransom. His guide, a man of mixed blood named Thorir, led them to a sacred clearing, where stood a mound the height of 2 men. Within this mound, protected by carved idols of fearsome aspect, lay wealth beyond counting, the accumulated trade goods of many seasons. Archaeological evidence partially confirms this account. A large storage site dating to the late 10th century has been discovered near the White Sea coast, containing remains of a wooden structure that apparently housed trade goods awaiting transport. The site shows evidence of a violent assault, with arrowheads of Norse design embedded in the structural timbers and human remains bearing wounds consistent with Viking weapons. What makes this particular raid noteworthy is its aftermath, described in chilling detail in the saga. Olaf's men filled 12 chests with plunder and began their return journey before dawn. Yet by midday, strange cries echoed through the forest around them. By evening, arrows fired by unseen hands had claimed 6 lives. By the third day, the Biamians seemed to materialise from the very air, striking and vanishing before swords could be drawn. Only 1 ship returned to Norway, with but 8 survivors who spoke of horrors no man should witness. This pattern repeated throughout the Viking Age. Norse attempts to seize Biamian trade goods by force might succeed initially, but invariably resulted in devastating counterattacks that made such raids prohibitively costly. Over time, most Viking leaders concluded that peaceful trade, even at disadvantageous terms, was preferable to the alternative. The economic relationship between Vikings and Biamians reveals a fascinating power dynamic that contradicts conventional narratives of Norse dominance. Despite their military prowess and far-reaching trade networks, the Vikings found themselves unable to control the flow of valuable northern commodities. The Biamians, through their environmental mastery and effective resistance strategies, maintained their economic autonomy throughout the Viking Age. This economic dimension adds crucial context to the conflict between these cultures. The Vikings were not merely exploring unknown territories or seeking new lands to settle. They were attempting to control lucrative trade resources that formed a vital link in international commerce. The Biamians, for their part, were not simply defending their homeland, but protecting their position as gatekeepers to some of the medieval world's most valuable luxury goods. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this economic relationship was how it influenced cultural exchange and mutual perception. Trade necessitated communication, which in turn required some degree of understanding between these very different peoples. This interface, sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent, produced cultural adaptations on both sides that would have lasting consequences for the northern world. What happens when a strongly patriarchal warrior culture encounters a society where women hold positions of spiritual and political authority? How do men who define themselves through martial prowess respond when faced with female opponents who command both respect and fear? The collision between Viking and Biamian gender norms created one of the most fascinating and disruptive aspects of their cultural interaction. Most terrifying of all their strange customs, wrote Adam of Bremen in his 11th century chronicle, is that among the Biamians, women may become shamans and chieftains with power equal to or greater than men. They practice divination through means too profane to describe and lead war parties against those who violate their territories. Norse traders speak of female archers whose arrows never miss their mark, and of priestesses who can call storms down upon ships that displease them. Archaeological evidence strongly supports the account of female authority in Biamian society. Unlike Viking burial sites, where clear gender distinctions appear in grave goods and positioning, Biamian graves show more egalitarian patterns. Female burials frequently contain items associated with hunting, shamanic practice, and leadership, suggesting these roles were not gender restricted, as they typically were in Norse culture. Particularly noteworthy are several high-status female burials dating from the 9th and 10th centuries. One discovered near Lake Onega contained the remains of a woman approximately 40 years old, interred with an elaborate shamanic drum, a carved staff of office, and a bow of exceptional quality. Another site near the White Sea yielded a female burial with a ceremonial knife, silver ornaments of both Biamian and Norse design, and a collection of divination tools including polished stones and animal bones inscribed with symbols. These archaeological findings align with accounts from Norse sagas that frequently mention Biamian witch women or shield maidens who wielded both spiritual and martial power. While such accounts must be read critically, filtered as they are through the Norse cultural lens, the consistency with which they appear suggests they reflect genuine encounters with female Biamian leaders. The warband that ambushed Thorir's men was led by a tall woman with hair white as snow, despite her youthful face, recounts the saga of Örvar Odd. She carried a bow of horn and bone, and wore a cloak adorned with symbols that hurt the eye to look upon. When she raised her hand, her warriors attacked without sound. When she lowered it, they vanished into the forest like mist. Thorir himself she killed with an arrow through his right eye, though he stood protected by 2 shield-bearers. This description of a female military leader represents a profound challenge to Norse gender norms. While Viking society did allow women certain rights unusual for the medieval period, including property ownership, the right to divorce and limited legal autonomy, it maintained strict gender segregation in most domains. Warfare, political leadership, and religious authority, with the notable exception of cedar practice, were overwhelmingly male preserves. The encounter with Biamian female leaders forced Norsemen to confront women who operated outside these familiar categories. Women who commanded respect not through male kinship connections, but through their own spiritual power and martial skill. This confrontation appears to have been profoundly unsettling to Viking warriors, challenging their fundamental assumptions about gender and power. Hakon would not admit he had been defeated by a woman, notes the saga of Hakon the Good, though all who survived the ambush swore it was the Biamian witch queen who planned the attack and fired the arrow that killed his brother. He claimed instead that they had fought against spirits who merely took female form to shame them. Few believed this tale, but none dared contradict him openly. This account highlights the psychological defence mechanism employed by many Norsemen when confronted with female Biamian power, attributing it to supernatural forces rather than acknowledging female capability that contradicted their worldview. By recategorizing Biamian women as witches or spirits, Viking warriors could preserve their gender assumptions while explaining their defeats. Archaeological evidence suggests that Biamian women's authority was particularly pronounced in three domains: spiritual practice, trade negotiation, and defensive warfare. Shamanic implements associated with female burials indicate their central role in religious life. Trade sites show evidence of female participation in negotiations, with Norse accounts frequently mentioning wise women who set terms for exchange, and multiple saga accounts describe female leaders organising ambushes and defensive operations against Viking incursions. The Biamian trading party was led by an old woman whose face was tattooed with blue lines, records a merchant account preserved in the Hauksbok. She inspected each item offered in trade with extraordinary care, testing silver with her teeth and examining cloth by both touch and smell. Nothing escaped her attention, and she would accept only the highest quality goods in exchange for her furs. When our captain attempted to substitute inferior silver in one payment, she detected the deception immediately and threatened to end all trade. He was forced to apologise with additional gifts before she would continue. This account of a female trade leader illustrates how Biamian gender practices created practical problems for Norse merchants, accustomed to dealing primarily with men in commercial matters. Viking traders had to adapt their approach or risk losing access to valuable northern commodities. Over time, this forced adaptation appears to have influenced Norse gender attitudes, at least among those who regularly traded with the Biamians. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements with strong northern trade connections shows subtle shifts in gender patterns during the 10th and 11th centuries, with women gradually assuming more prominent roles in certain commercial activities. But perhaps the most profound impact of Biamian gender practices on Norse culture appears in the evolving saga depictions of shield maidens and valkyries. While female warriors had always existed in Norse mythology, their portrayal shifts noticeably during the Viking Age. Earlier accounts tend to present them as purely supernatural beings or as anomalous women who temporarily adopt male roles. Later accounts, particularly those from regions with Biamian contact, depict them more naturalistically as women who combine martial skill with spiritual power, a description remarkably similar to actual Biamian female leaders. It cannot be coincidence, argues archaeologist Inga Håkansdottir, that Norse literary traditions about powerful female figures expanded precisely during the period of most intensive contact with Biamian culture. The Valkyrie evolved from a simple battlefield spirit to a complex figure who moves between worlds and wields both weapons and magic, much like the Biamian shamanic leaders Vikings encountered in the north. This cultural influence represents one of the most significant and overlooked aspects of the Viking-Biamian relationship. Beyond the military stalemate and economic competition, these cultures were engaged in a subtler contest of worldviews, particularly regarding the proper roles and capabilities of women and men. The evidence suggests that in this ideological battle, Biamian concepts made significant inroads into Norse thinking, challenging and gradually modifying traditional Viking gender assumptions. But the most dramatic confrontation between these cultures came not through gradual influence, but in direct military conflict, a series of large-scale encounters that would ultimately determine the balance of power in the northern world. Have you ever wondered what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? When a culture built on conquest and expansion collides with one that refuses to yield? The answer lies in a series of confrontations that culminated in what Norse sagas call the Battle of Sleeping Fires, perhaps the most devastating defeat ever inflicted on a Viking military force. By the early 11th century, the pattern of limited raids and ambushes that had characterized Viking-Biamian conflict for generations was giving way to something more organized and deadly. As the Norse kingdoms consolidated power and converted to Christianity, their leaders increasingly viewed the northern territories not merely as sources of trade goods, but as pagan lands to be conquered and incorporated into their expanding realms. King Olaf II of Norway, later known as Saint Olaf, was particularly determined to extend his control northward. A zealous convert to Christianity, Olaf combined religious motivation with economic and political ambition. The Biamian territories represented both a spiritual challenge, a stronghold of pagan practices, and a material prize in the form of trade resources that still flowed through intermediaries rather than directly to Norwegian markets. Olaf swore before Christmas that he would bring the northern lands under his rule before the next winter's snow, records the saga of Olaf Haraldsson. He ordered the construction of 15 longships of shallow draft suitable for coastal raiding, and sent word throughout Norway that great wealth awaited those who joined his expedition against the Biamians. By spring he had gathered a force of nearly 500 warriors, including many of his finest hired men and several priests carrying crosses and holy relics. Archaeological evidence confirms the historical reality behind this saga account. Excavations near Trondheim have uncovered the remains of shipbuilding activities dating to 1026 CE, including discarded wood shavings and tool marks consistent with the construction of vessels designed for northern coastal waters. Additionally, several runic inscriptions from this period mention preparations for a Great Northern Journey, or the King's Expedition to Bjarmeland. Olaf's campaign represented a significant escalation in the conflict. Previous Viking expeditions had typically involved 1 to 3 ships and fewer than 100 men. This force, 15 ships and 500 warriors, constituted a major military operation by early medieval standards. It signalled a shift from opportunistic raiding to systematic conquest. The Norse force departed in late spring of 1026 CE, following the coastal route around the Kola Peninsula and into the White Sea. Initial progress was rapid, with several small fishing settlements abandoned before the Vikings arrived, their inhabitants apparently warned by Biamian scouts. Olaf established a forward base on an island near the mouth of the northern Divina River, from which he launched smaller raids into the surrounding territory. For 20 days, Olaf's men encountered no resistance. The saga continues. They found empty villages, with fires still burning and food still warm upon the hearth, yet no living soul remained to defend them. The king grew confident, declaring that the Biamians had fled in terror of his might. His priests erected crosses in the abandoned settlements and performed baptisms in the rivers and lakes, claiming the land for Christ and Norway. This initial phase of the campaign reveals the Biamian strategic response to this unprecedented threat. Rather than engaging the superior Norse force directly, they employed a scorched earth tactic, evacuating settlements in the invaders' path while preserving their population and resources. Archaeological evidence suggests this withdrawal was pre-planned and orderly, with valuable items carefully removed and structures left intact but empty. As summer progressed, Olaf pushed his forces farther inland along the river valleys that served as natural highways through the dense forests. Here the first signs of resistance appeared, subtle at first, then increasingly deadly. Scouts began to disappear, records the saga. Men sent to find water would vanish without cry or call for help. Strange sounds echoed through the forests at night, drums beating in complex rhythms, voices chanting in unknown tongues. Some warriors claimed to see figures watching from the trees, but when arrows were fired at these apparitions, they found nothing but bark and leaves, pierced by their shafts. This psychological warfare, so effective against smaller Viking parties, proved less devastating against Olaf's larger force with its religious motivation. The king interpreted these events as demonic harassment and used them to reinforce his men's Christian zeal. He ordered priests to sprinkle holy water around encampments and led his warriors in prayer each morning and evening. By midsummer, Olaf's expedition had penetrated deeper into Biamian territory than any previous Norse force. Following the northern Divina upstream, they approached what the saga calls the Sacred Lake, where the Biamians gather to worship their false gods, likely a reference to Lake Knosero, which archaeological evidence suggests was an important ceremonial site. It was here that the Biamians finally revealed their full defensive strategy, a plan of extraordinary sophistication that had been weeks in preparation. As Olaf's ships rounded the river bend, they beheld a great lake surrounded by forests, the saga recounts. At its centre stood an island where many buildings could be seen, their roofs gleaming with what appeared to be precious metals. Smoke rose from numerous hearths, and the king rejoiced, believing they had found the main settlement of the Biamians with all its wealth intact. What Olaf did not realise was that he was seeing an elaborate trap. Archaeological evidence from Lake Canozero reveals the remains of temporary structures built specifically as decoys, facades constructed to resemble a prosperous settlement when viewed from a distance. The gleaming roofs mentioned in the saga were likely polished birch bark or thin sheets of mica that mimicked the appearance of valuable metals when catching the sunlight. The king ordered 10 ships to approach the island while 5 remained in reserve, continues the saga. As they crossed the open water, no resistance appeared. The island seemed peaceful, with smoke still rising from the buildings. But as the first ships touched shore and men began to disembark, the trap was sprung. The archaeological record reveals an ingenious ambush. The Biamians had constructed concealed positions around the lakeshore, camouflaged with branches and earth. From these positions, archers could target the exposed Vikings on their ships. More significantly, they had prepared a devastating, incendiary attack. Suddenly burning arrows arced from the forest surrounding the lake, the saga describes. These were no ordinary arrows, but carried some substance that clung to wood and flesh alike, burning with unquenchable fury. At the same moment, warriors emerged from hidden doors in the seemingly abandoned buildings on the island, trapping the disembarked men between 2 forces. Modern analysis suggests these unquenchable flames were an early form of what would later be called Greek fire, likely a mixture of pine resin, animal fat, and sulphur that would adhere to surfaces and continue burning even on water. Archaeological excavations have uncovered ceramic containers consistent with the storage of such substances, along with specialised arrowheads designed to carry incendiary materials. The battle quickly turned against the Norse force. Ships caught fire, forcing men to jump into the water, where they became easy targets for Biamian archers. Those who reached the island found themselves facing fighters who emerged from concealed underground passages, a signature Biamian tactic documented at several other sites. The king ordered the reserve ships to rescue those in the water, records the saga. But as they approached, more fire rained down upon them. 3 ships burned to the waterline and sank. 2 others managed to collect survivors before retreating toward the river mouth. Olaf himself, seeing the disaster unfolding, commanded a withdrawal, but as his remaining ships turned to flee, they discovered the river behind them blocked. Archaeological evidence confirms this account of a coordinated, multi-phase ambush. The Biamians had apparently felled trees into the river during the battle, creating a barrier that prevented easy escape. This forced the surviving Norse ships to navigate a narrow channel where they were vulnerable to attacks from the shoreline. As night fell, the forests around the lake seemed to come alive with fire, continues the saga. Hundreds of torches moved among the trees, revealing the true size of the Biamian force that had gathered from all parts of their territory. Their war drums beat continuously, and their shamans called upon spirits with wild dances around great bonfires. Few of Olaf's men slept that night, knowing what dawn would bring. The sleeping fires that give this battle its name refer to what happened next, a tactic unprecedented in European warfare of the period. With first light, a strange mist rose from the lake, the saga recounts. At first, Olaf thought God had sent fog to cover their retreat, but as the mist reached the ships, men began to cough, and their eyes streamed with tears. Some fell to the decks gasping for breath, while others jumped into the water seeking relief from the burning in their lungs. Archaeological and paleoecological evidence provides a scientific explanation for this mist. The lake basin contained natural deposits of sulfur, which the Biamians apparently knew how to exploit. By burning specific materials in the surrounding forests under carefully monitored wind conditions, they created a toxic low-lying cloud of sulfur dioxide that flowed across the water toward the trapped Viking fleet. This chemical warfare, combined with conventional attacks from Biamian forces, proved devastating. The saga reports that only 2 ships and fewer than 60 men ultimately escaped the trap. King Olaf himself survived, though the saga notes he coughed blood for many days afterward and never regained his full strength. The Battle of Sleeping Fires marked a decisive turning point in Viking-Biamian relations. Never again would Norse kings attempt large-scale military operations against Biamian territories. The psychological impact of this defeat, inflicted not by a civilized power like the Byzantine Empire or the Caliphate, but by people the Norse had considered primitive forest dwellers, was profound and lasting. After Kenazero, wrote an Icelandic chronicler a generation later, the northern lands were spoken of with dread among Norwegians. Mothers would frighten disobedient children with tales of Biamian shamans who stole the breath from sleeping warriors. Even the mention of trade voyages to those regions would cause experienced sailors to make the sign of the cross and fall silent. The battle demonstrated the culmination of Biamian defensive strategy, the ability to coordinate resources across their territory, to prepare elaborate traps, and to use the environment itself as a weapon against invaders. It represented not merely a tactical victory, but a triumph of asymmetric warfare against a technologically and numerically superior force. But history rarely provides clean endings or permanent victories. As the medieval period progressed, new forces would enter the northern world, transforming the relationship between these ancient adversaries and eventually threatening both their ways of life. What happens to ancient enemies when the world around them changes beyond recognition? How do centuries-old patterns of conflict and cooperation transform when new powers emerge that threaten both parties equally? The final chapter in the Viking-Biamian story is one of gradual transformation rather than dramatic conclusion, a slow fading of both cultures as the medieval world gave way to new political realities. The 12th and 13th centuries brought profound changes to Northern Europe. The consolidation of Christian kingdoms, the rise of the Hanseatic League as a trading power, and the eastward expansion of Novgorod and other Russia's principalities created new pressures on both Norse and Biamian societies. These changes would ultimately transform their relationship from one of direct confrontation to something more complex and interdependent. The old ways are passing, wrote an anonymous Norwegian cleric around 1150 CE. Where once our grandfathers ventured north in dragon ships, seeking plunder from the Biamians, now merchants sail in trading cogs carrying cloth and silver to exchange for furs. The forest people no longer ambush travellers, but meet them at established markets under the protection of both their spirits and our Christian God. Some have even accepted baptism, though they maintain many heathen practices in secret. Archaeological evidence confirms this gradual normalization of relations. Trading posts that show signs of defensive structures and clear cultural separation in earlier periods evolve into more integrated settlements by the late 12th century. Artifacts reveal increasing cultural exchange, with Biamian decorative motifs appearing on Norse objects and vice versa. Christian churches appear in formerly Biamian territories, though often incorporating elements of traditional spiritual practices. This transformation was driven by several factors. First, the Christianization of Scandinavia removed one dimension of conflict. While religious differences remained, the institutional pressure for conversion replaced the earlier Viking pattern of individual raiding. Second, the formalization of trade through the emerging market system of medieval Europe created more stable economic relationships. Finally, both cultures faced new external pressures that made their old enmity increasingly impractical. The Karelians and Tavastians press from the west, while the men of Novgorod come from the south with crosses and swords, records a fragmentary Biamian account preserved in a later Finnish manuscript. Our old enemies, the Northmen, now offer alliance against these new threats. Their priests speak of one god, while our shamans consult the spirits, yet both agree that we must stand together or separately fall. This pragmatic alliance against external threats represents a remarkable evolution in the relationship. Archaeological evidence from the late 12th and early 13th centuries reveals defensive structures that appear to have been built through Norse-Biamian cooperation, particularly along the southern approaches to Biamian territory, where Novgorod expansion posed the greatest threat. But despite these adaptations, both cultures faced inexorable pressure from the changing medieval world. The Viking Age had effectively ended by the mid-11th century, with Norse societies increasingly integrated into mainstream European political structures. The independent raiding and trading that had characterized earlier periods gave way to more conventional medieval kingdoms, with centralized authority and Christian ideology. The Biamians faced even greater challenges to their traditional way of life. Their semi-nomadic patterns of movement, shamanic spiritual practices, and decentralized social organization were increasingly at odds with the administrative needs of the emerging states around them. As Christianity advanced northward, their sacred sites were converted or destroyed. As trade became more regulated, their role as independent suppliers of northern goods diminished. The old woman who leads the Biamian trading party has fewer furs each year, noted a Hanseatic merchant in 1230 CE. She tells that her people must travel farther to find the sable and fox that once abounded near their settlements. The best hunting grounds now lie in territories claimed by Novgorod, where her hunters are sometimes killed as poachers on land their ancestors walked freely for countless generations. This account highlights the environmental and territorial pressures that increasingly constrained Biamian lifeways. Archaeological evidence shows their settlement patterns becoming more sedentary and concentrated during this period, likely in response to the loss of traditional hunting territories and the need for more defensive postures against expanding states. By the late 13th century, the distinct Biamian identity was increasingly subsumed into other ethnic groups or absorbed by expanding states. Some communities were incorporated into the Novgorod Republic, adopting Russian Orthodox Christianity while maintaining elements of their traditional culture. Others migrated westward, merging with Karelian and Sami populations. Still others moved farther north and east, seeking to preserve their independence in increasingly remote regions. The last true Biamians now dwell beyond the northern mountains, wrote a Russian Orthodox missionary in 1290 CE. They maintain the old ways, preserving their dead, consulting spirits, and living as their ancestors did. Each year there are fewer of them, as the young people leave for the trading towns or accept baptism. Soon none will remain who remember the ancient songs or know the paths through the deepest forests. Archaeological evidence confirms this gradual dissolution, rather than any catastrophic end. Biamian material culture doesn't disappear suddenly, but gradually transforms, incorporating elements from Russian, Karelian, and Sami traditions while maintaining certain distinctive features. By the 14th century, it becomes increasingly difficult to identify purely Biamian sites, though their influence remains visible in syncretic cultures that succeeded them. The Vikings, too, underwent their own transformation. The Norse raiders who had once terrorized Europe evolved into conventional medieval kingdoms. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden became integrated into European political structures, their distinctive culture increasingly modified by continental influences. The Old Norse religion gave way to Christianity, though many folk beliefs and practices persisted in modified form. My grandfather told tales of the Biamian witchwomen who could call storms and transform into wolves, wrote a Norwegian merchant in 1340 CE. As a child, I trembled at these stories, but now I trade regularly with the people of the north. They are Christians like ourselves, though they maintain strange customs and speak an unusual tongue. It is hard to imagine they are the same people who once defeated King Olaf's great expedition and sent his warriors fleeing in terror. This account captures the historical amnesia that gradually obscured the once intense conflict between these peoples. As generations passed, the vivid reality of Viking Biamian confrontation faded into legend and folklore. The actual Biamians became conflated with other northern peoples in Norse accounts, while their distinctive culture and resistance strategies were increasingly forgotten. Yet traces of this ancient conflict and its resolution persist in the archaeological record and in cultural memories preserved through folklore. The Biamian influence on northern cultures remains visible in spiritual practices, artistic motifs, and environmental adaptations. Elements of their resistance strategies against the Vikings became incorporated into the military traditions of later northern peoples. Perhaps most significantly, the story of Viking-Biamian interaction offers a counter-narrative to simplistic views of Viking Age expansion. It demonstrates that Norse dominance was neither universal nor inevitable, that even at the height of their power, the Vikings encountered peoples who successfully resisted their advances through superior adaptation to local conditions and innovative, asymmetric tactics. The true legacy of the Biamians, argues historian Elina Quosmanen, lies not in monuments or written records, but in proving that cultural survival doesn't always require victory in conventional terms. They never defeated the Vikings in open battle or conquered Norse territories. Instead, they made the cost of domination prohibitively high, forcing accommodation rather than submission. In doing so, they preserved their autonomy and cultural identity for centuries against one of history's most successful expansionist cultures. This perspective offers valuable insights for understanding other historical interactions between dominant expansionist societies and smaller cultures that successfully maintained their independence through asymmetric means. The Biamian example demonstrates that effective resistance doesn't require matching an opponent's strength directly, but can instead exploit their weaknesses and limitations. As we conclude this exploration of the forgotten tribe that terrified the Vikings, we are left with a story more nuanced and complex than conventional narratives of conquest and submission. The Biamians never defeated the Vikings in the conventional sense. They never sailed to Norway to raid Norse settlements or conquered Swedish territories. Their victory lay in something more subtle, but no less significant: the preservation of their autonomy and way of life against overwhelming odds. In the frozen forests of the far north, they created a domain where even the fearsome Vikings tread with caution and dread. Through environmental mastery, asymmetric warfare, psychological operations, and cultural practices that unnerved their opponents, they transformed their apparent disadvantages